أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا أنصار الله كما قال عيسى بن مريم للحواريين من أنصاري إلى الله قال الحواريون نحن أنصار الله فآمنت طائفة من بني إسرائيل وكفرت طائفة فأيدنا الذين آمنوا على عدوهم فأصبحوا ظاهرين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O you who believe, be ye helpers of Allah. As said Jesus, the son of Mary, to the disciples, who will be my helpers to the work of Allah? Said the disciples, we are Allah's helpers. Then a portion of the children of Israel believed, and a portion disbelieved. But we gave power to those who believed against their enemies, and they became the ones that prevailed. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another edition of Islam for Europeans. I didn't want to make two reaction videos in a row, but did want to address, the recent debate yesterday between Daniel Haqiqatjou from the Muslim Skeptic and prominent British white nationalist Mark Collett. So definitely, okay, let's get it out of the way first. Daniel, he didn't do his research. I'm not here to deride Daniel. Or, blast him. It's more of a whole zeitgeist than anything else. Very, very few people, even in the West, don't understand, a lot of these positions of, of European nationalism, let alone many people in the Muslim community. So their frame of reference, as I stated before in several videos, was the media-approved, alt-light, anti-Islam crowd, like your Tommy Robinsons and your Milo Yiannopoulos and your Ezra Levants, who all push, liberalism as well. And this was, I'm sure other Muslim debaters would have thought the exact same thing heading in, which, I guess is part of the growing pains. But, that's definitely one thing. And I'm glad that it eventually, turned into a cordial conversation. But now Daniel is faced with another huge problem, and that is going to be the fallout from the Muslim community, as if there isn't enough already. Once they get wind that he had this discussion, So I just wanted to provide an overall analysis of the whole debate without agreeing with either of them and their positions. I go my own way, and I have a third take on this that is, on a political level, I guess, outside or completely, outside the box, what these two gentlemen were talking about. Because I think overall, a lot of their discussion was, based completely on theoretical what if constructs. Which to a degree is understandable because, looking at this or assessing this situation, you would think that it would be impossible, to resolve. It's almost like it's trying to put the toothpaste back into the tube. So, take for example, Mark, his political organization is completely, there's no way he can even put a ballot, for any seat in the House of Lords. All of his bank accounts of him and his members have all been, closed and frozen. He's been deplatformed on every channel. So I don't understand how he thinks that, this is going to be successful, even from his end. And then on Daniel's end, and I don't want to, single out Daniel. This is more of what we see with, Muslim communities in the West is that, they don't really understand. I'm talking about, the heads of Islamic organizations. They don't really understand the situation on the ground, whether that's the, born Muslim subcommunities in general, or what happens to converts when they convert to Islam, or how many of them leave, and what's the result of them after their conversion, and what blocks people from converting to Islam in the first place. Right. So those are very important constructs before we move forward. To actually, set a game plan in place. So I know we've talked about that several times on this channel. If you're new to our channel here at Islam for Europeans, what we advocate for is that Muslims living in non-Muslim countries have an obligation to give Dawa to, the communities that they're living with. In order to do that effectively, they need to be able to keep their own cultures, right? And this doesn't just go for the West, but anywhere in the world in which Muslims are the minority, whether it's Japan or Korea or Mexico. In order to do that effectively, you need to allow the converts who come in to collectivize, form their own organizations, handle their affairs, look after each other, and develop, Islam within their own cultural paradigm, which means keeping, coming back to their traditional dress that is specific to them within an Islamic framework, the cuisine, the architecture, the sports and games, even the slang and the language, even if the language has been lost, as we see with a lot of, European countries that are becoming more Anglicanized. And in turn, the Muslim community would have far more legitimacy because now they would be providing something of value. And then what would happen with that is that just naturally, the converts from that area, it would be a lot easier for them to form their own marriage networks, help their families get involved, and that way, their families can see, their son and their daughter-in-law, or their daughter and their son-in-law, have an Islamic marriage where they see the beauty of this relationship, and then they have kids, and then they marry within that group as well. And the knee jerk reaction to that, I can tell from a lot of traditionalist Muslims would be to reject that idea, because it's such an outside the box concept, because we're living in such a multicultural society nowadays, and it's seen as creating division. When in actuality, this is what's been going on in the West since Muslims have moved here. All Muslim, I mean, we still have cordial relationships with Muslims from other backgrounds, but at the same time, they've formed their own organizations, their own butcher shops, their own restaurants. They've kept their language, they've kept their culture. So this is just natural. And to force this kind of idea that all of these people are going to not only live in the same city, but pray in the same mosque, and run it all together, and then kind of have this homogenized blob, it doesn't really play out in the real world, right? And I think this debate between Daniel and Mark, it just opens up a lot of questions about how the Muslim community is going to proceed forward, and this is definitely one of them, because for the longest time, heads of Muslims organizations from across the the spectrum, have kind of pushed this kind of monocultural solution to the Muslim community's problems. This partly is due to the fact that they look at the fall of the Ottoman Empire as caused directly because of division within the Ummah. A lot of them have been oppressed by nationalist governments, and they take a look at the hadith, the ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who spoke out vehemently against asabiya, or what is referred to as nationalism, right? So, I guess we really need to define what that is. What is nationalism to the point that it becomes haram? If a group converts to Islam and they keep the good things in their culture, they have their own club in which they allow other Muslims and give them all their due rights to visit there and pray there and break their fast there and give salam. But it's run by them, it's run for them, and they're not going to change their food, their cuisine, and they for the most part marry within their own cultural group. Is that nationalism? I think that's one of the major questions that we have to ask as a Muslim community going forward, because when we think of the term nationalism, that's what we think of. It has such a negative connotation to it within traditionalist Muslim circles. When you're going to this, when you're going to this crowd now, when they say that they're nationalists, the images that it pops up in their head is that it's everyone's going to live in their very defined ethno-states, which is not going to happen. I mean, it's we live in a multicultural world now, and we have to accept that, right? So, and that's maybe brings up more questions too, like And I know, if had Daniel had more time to prepare for this, he could have actually asked these questions, like, what is going to happen to the Muslims living in the UK, if ever, like a nationalist government would come to power in any European country, and we see Zemmour gaining more steam in France, which is definitely becoming more worrisome for French Muslims, you know. But this idea of allowing, of obligating the Muslims to, bring for the converts who do come in, encouraging them to keep everything within their culture and forming their own groups. That would give them, it would give legitimacy to Islam in the West. And it will allow this, like to occur organically, right? And I think this, it brings up another question of Islamic history, because Daniel in that debate said that the Muslims lived in a multicultural society, right? Now, in one sense, that's true, in that there were Muslims moving from place to place, like the Arab conquest, going out into the rest of the Muslim world, giving Dawa to those regions, becoming leaders of those regions. You had cities like Baghdad where there were different cultures living in the same city, but that if you want to call them multiculturalism, I don't think that even compares to what we have nowadays. Where we have hundreds of different nationalities living within one metropole. You know, um, history back then was a different time. Like there were no airplanes, there were no cars. Like you didn't have ships that had that could carry more than a couple hundred people. So migration was rare. It was on foot, or by animal. And then when Muslims or anybody did move to another city or another country, they were expected to assimilate into that community, right? So, a lot of them did, and they basically took on the culture, and they adapted to the culture. If you look at my previous conversation with Ismail Kamdar, he said that when the Muslims went to Sham, went from Mecca, Medina, and they immigrated and conquered land which is now Syria and Jordan and Palestine. They were basically became unrecognizable. They changed the way they dress, and the leader, the emir, was Muslim. It just, like he had to live this extravagant lifestyle, not like the lifestyle of the leader, in Medina where you just slept under a palm tree, because he knew that if he didn't live this extravagant lifestyle, then the communities weren't going to respect him, right? So, to call the Muslim world a multicultural society, back then it's an oversimplification. Um, like even when it comes to marriages, at most you would be marrying somebody within a 100-mile radius. So, they just, like it was just a different time back then. So it wasn't like you just, met somebody online from halfway around the world, brought them there and married them, right? And even still, I mean, even with all this going on, kafah, or cultural compatibility in marriage, was highly recommended in 3 of the 4 schools of thought, right? So, like it took into account geographical distance, cultural compatibility, lineage, status, profession, religiosity. And these are all, and these are all taken into account. It didn't mean that it was haram to marry someone from a different culture or a different race. But what was recommended is that you make the people who are getting married, when you're marrying your daughter to, a new spouse, you have to make sure that those cultures are compatible, right? So trying to say that everything was like this multicultural paradise in the Muslim world, and like everyone was getting along. I mean, it's an oversimplification, and I think when you're trying to oversimplify things, it just you're really digging yourself a hole, because if they research it and it turns out not to be true, it's it's doing a disservice, really, right? So, um, yeah. So, getting, now, critiquing, Mark's side. I mean, like he, said that, like he thinks that, there needs to be a sense of nationalism for people to, reject, the liberal society. But I really think that trying to do that via Christianity, um, I don't think it's strong enough to serve as a bulwark against the liberal society that we live in. He said that he wanted to ban pornography. Well, I mean, like I stated before, like it's very rare that he's going to become like a leader in any capacity, or in people who have the same ideas as him. So you're not going to be able to ban porn. I mean, it's going to be there 24/7 on every single iPhone and every single computer, right? So, like Christianity, I mean, I went to a Catholic grade school and a Catholic high school, and this is not to bash people who are Christian, but very few people wholeheartedly believed in the tenets of Christianity, right? So, um, and there are some people who did, but for those, the vast majority that didn't, like like they didn't really serve as like a reason to stop doing things that were bad. It didn't make people stop drinking alcohol. It didn't make people stop looking at porn. It didn't make people stop doing, hardcore drugs. And this was, my high school is 95% white. And it just didn't, it was just past its time, and it just seemed antiquated. Um, and it did serve as a, like a thing of solidarity, and like with like having the mass together and everything. But I would say that at the end of the day, that was in the 1990s. I mean, the 1990s seemed downright conservative, compared to what we have now in the 2020s. So I don't think that, Christianity, in its form today would serve as a sufficient bulwark against, the liberalism, that the West is facing itself with. Right. So that's another issue. And yeah, I mean, also of note, I mean, and like I know that Mark was going to, I guess, say the quiet part loud. I guess you all know what I'm referring to. Um, and because Daniel, unfortunately wasn't able to, formulate, what was it going to say if he keeps bringing that up. You have to, think of you have to refer back to the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how that applies, today in the 21st century context. Like the Jewish community, they're not a monolith. I mean, there are Jews who are against, what Israel is doing. There are anti-Zionist Jews in that regard. You have, I'm sure there are Jews, and I've interviewed Duvid before, who probably think that, this, interview is an absolute nightmare, because, it means that, it's almost like groups are going to be, grouping up against us. But with our model of the idea of, European Muslim subcommunities, we would be respecting every religion and every group. At the end of the day, the Jews are still the people of the book, and you can't, collectively blame an entire people for the actions of their elites. And this is what Daniel was doing with, with Europeans, when he was, criticizing colonialism. You know, things that Europeans were doing in the 19th century to what whites are the whites that are born now. Most of them have absolutely nothing to do with colonialism or their ancestors, and they didn't really benefit from colonialism either. I mean, they were making like 2 cents an hour in like a factory or a mine somewhere. So this idea that colonialism was just about absolute death and destruction, and that whites are to blame for it. I'm glad that Mark was able to veer him away from that conversation. So hopefully, they stop talking about it. But having said that, Mark basically did the same thing. I mean, let's just call a spade a spade. He's basically saying that, quote unquote Jews are responsible for, what, everything from pornography to wars in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. And those are the elites of that group. I mean, the ones who work 9 to 5 jobs, they're going to see this, the everyday Jews, they're going to see this interview and think, yeah, what have our elites, done, to, make things absolutely worse for us. And, there are groups like Nuturi Karta, who see, Zionism, as completely antithetical to Judaism. And in our proposed solution, in which we would be just European Muslims would be collectivizing, we would give them that option. If the Jewish community wants to support us and our idea, that they would instantly reduce anti-Semitism, and then that way, it's given that legitimacy. I know that not everyone's going to agree with it. It's still going to be seen completely unpalatable to a lot of them. But again, we are Muslims. We give every group a fair shot. We rule by justice, and we don't punish people, for what other people in the group, other people of that group have done. Right. So, and even if you look at the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you had Jews like Abdullah ibn Salam. He converted to Islam. There were other, and there were other Jews who converted to Islam, but it was ruled by, the whole, history of that. It was ruled by justice by the Muslims, right? So at the end of the day, I mean, that's the direction that we need to go in, or else we're not going to be able to, to survive, for one. I'm not saying that to be, like a chicken or anything. This is following correct Islamic ethics, right? So yeah, so that's that. And then on a final note, and I mentioned this, when I saw the Muhammad Hijab Jordan Peterson reaction video, a lot of Muslims in the chat were saying, Mark should convert to Islam. And while I can appreciate that sentiment in that, we want all human beings to convert to Islam and be saved from the hellfire, and that's very important. I think just as important is to realize that there is really nothing that we have in place to build institutions or accept a group of European Muslims into the fold, whether they're nationalists or not. I mean, like, it's very, very tough to be a convert to Islam. Very tough. The ones that do make it are the only ones that people see, right? And this is what leads to the whole white saviorism, white supremacy, um, you know, critique that a lot of, especially African American Muslims, and rightly so, rail against when they hear Daniel saying, "Oh, like I know a lot of white Muslims and they're the best." It's not that we're the best. What's happening is that it's such a difficult adjustment to make that only the very quote unquote best, or the ones who are in the best situations, are able to A, convert to Islam, and B, join a Muslim community and be visible. I mean, that is a very tough thing to do. Not just, for a religion that's even, that's a complete lifestyle change, and a lot of converts or people who are interested in Islam, they simply can't hack it. Like, you are going to face ostracization, and estrangement, and anger, from your spouse, from your family, from your community, and you're going to come into another community that has a completely different culture than you do, a completely different mindset, and although they really want what's best for you, it's just a lot of them have, let's be honest, a lot of anger towards your people, right? And vice versa. I mean, your non-Muslims, like, your family and community, they may have a lot of anger towards Muslims, right? Like this debate that happened yesterday, this is a conversation that happens once in a lifetime. Very rarely do your non-Muslim and Muslim worlds interact, and they might not ever interact. And you're a Muslim community, the amount of money and resources they would have to put into trying to mitigate the relationship with their family, I mean, that's just not going to work. Like a community, I mean, there's so many things that go into it, restaurants, a collective identity, a collective culture, a language, like third spaces, cuisine, dress, to give yourself like a sense of belonging. The multicultural model, the monocultural model that Muslims have been, trying to do in the West for such a long time, they think it's effective because, converts will buy into it and, like go in all in. And that's what I did as well. And think that this is the answer. But it's a completely different paradigm than what we see, with Islam historically. And that is that people converted to Islam en masse, and they kept everything that they were doing, just getting rid of the things that were haram and degenerate. So, and I think that's the major disconnect that we see between the heads of Islamic organizations, and, the people who are working on this on the ground, within mosques and Islamic organizations, your social workers, the people the volunteers who try to help out converts, the converts themselves. And, I think that, trying this kind of model, it really doesn't address the main issue. So, yeah, if Mark converted to Islam, that's great. But I really don't think the Muslim community would be able to deal with the fallout. Like yeah, I mean, I thought if Jordan Peterson converted to Islam, it would be difficult, but I can't imagine what would happen that time. I mean, like yeah, so they really need to think about what we're going to do with the convert situation, and we need to realize that Allah made us into different tribes and nations so that we can recognize one another, right? So that's not a negation of one's tribe, um, and I think Daniel recognizes that, but until you see what converts to Islam are actually going through, especially European descendant converts, um, you know, uh, just saying that oh, you can keep your culture, keep everything about yourself is necessary but not sufficient. And until they collectivize as a group, just like every other Muslim subculture is done in the West, you're not going to get that. And Islam is going to be continue to be seen, as a religion that is estranged to the European mind. Okay, so that's it for today. Please feel free to leave comments in the comments section. Yeah, and I will be doing some other interviews in the future. I just I said I was going to have a big announcement to make. I will be on the Jolly Heretic, inshallah, Thursday, February 24th, 7 p.m. UK time. That's Dr. Edward Dutton's channel, to speak. I also am coming up to do an interview for Ilmfeed with Fatima Barkatullah. So that's coming Sunday, March 13th, I believe. And I have another scheduled interview to be announced with Duvid, and I'm sure he's probably watching this as well. Hopefully, we can provide, an alternative outlet that will satisfy not just the Europeans, not just the Muslim community, but also his community as well. So hopefully we can at least get a percentage of them on their side to realize that we do not advocate for violence or hatred or vandalism of any particular group. Okay, and yeah, just to add one more thing to that. I mean, eventually the like the liberal progressive left, they're going to find out about this interview that Daniel had, and they're just absolutely going to flip. And really, I can't, like it's going to be hard for Daniel to explain this away because he didn't really address the issue of what happens to Muslims living in the Muslim world in the West. Like he said that Mark said that he wouldn't bomb or commit violence against any Muslim country, right? But what happens to the Muslims on the ground in the UK or elsewhere? The fears of the Muslim community, I think, are legitimate in that they think that if this were to happen, it would cause a rise in anger and hatred towards Muslims and Islamophobic acts. Even if the politicians aren't even advocating for it, it's going to give more ability for them to do that. And that's an important question. Like without having like a framework of how are we going to frame this, vis-a-vis the Muslim community, it's just going to create more and more opposition. I mean, if you're an accelerationist, I mean, like you don't really care about that stuff. But I think, the situation is so delicate right now in the West, vis-a-vis Islam, that I think acceleration, isn't what we want at this point. Okay, so my name is Robert, Islam for Europeans. Please subscribe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.